Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and I am very happy to welcome you to today's CUGC Connect webinar with Nutanix. Going to be focusing on Citrix Persona and Nutanix Files. I think this is a topic that came out of maybe the last Nutanix webinar or the one before it, but I know it's been really, it was asked about and Jarian delivered. And so you guys are gonna love it. But before we get started, I've kicked off a poll while you guys were waiting. I was really curious to find out how many of you are still working at home and how many of you are going into the office or maybe even never left the office. And I think I can share the results. It was pretty interesting. The majority of you, here you go, should be showing up. Nope, there it is. So a lot of you are still at home. I think that's really interesting. And then like a really small percentage of you never actually left the office. So good to know. I'm actually in the CUGC office today because I had an internet outage at my home. So I'm one of the few. All right, just a couple of events we have coming up. We still have our CUGC local meetings. They're all happening virtually still, but we do have a lot coming up on our calendar for you. Tomorrow is our Philly group, and then you'll see that we have several of our local groups are banding together, which is awesome that we can do that now because we're having these meetings virtually. So, so check out our calendar, see what's coming up. Next week is our next Excel event, Great Plains. And then right after that, well, not right after that, but a couple weeks after that in September is our Midwest Excel, and Nutanix is a sponsor at both of those events. So we hope that you'll definitely check out those. All right, I'm going to get us started today with just a couple more announcements. We are recording today's webinar. You'll get a link to that recording. It's going to come directly from GoToWebinar, and it'll come tomorrow, so just be on the lookout for that. Also want you to submit your questions anytime. We'll take them during and after the presentation, depending on what they are and how it goes. And also towards the end, I'll be putting a link in the chat for you to a short survey that's for CUGC use only. It's completely anonymous, and we just like to get your feedback. All right, so who's with us today? We have Jake Walsh. Jake is a Citrix technology advocate, and I think, ironically enough, moderated the last Nutanix webinar. So Jake, you want to say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Stephanie. Pleasure to be here as always. A really good one lined up today. I had the pleasure of moderating. I think it was the last one Jarian did, and it was awesome. So you're in for a really good webinar today. Please do type your questions in, and we'll try and get through those as best we can.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. All right, and here he is. We have Jarian Gibson. He is a senior solutions architect at Nutanix. He's also a leader of our Kansas City group. And I also like to point out that Nutanix is a sponsor of our CUGC Women in Technology program. That program is a one-to-one mentoring program, and we're getting ready to kick off the applications for next year's program. So if you're interested in that, definitely give me a shout. I can put my email address in the chat for you. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jarian to get us going.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. You want to make me a presenter? Here we go.
Yeah, sorry, it took a minute. There was a little delay.
Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, looks great.
So first of all, thank you for having me. Always happy to help out the CUGC. So thanks for having me, Stephanie. And thank you, Jake, for moderating today. Always good to have you on here to help with the questions in the chat. Yeah, last webinar we did was with Dave Brett. He did a customer use case on his deployment with Nutanix and his migration from Zen Server to AHV, which is a pretty good webinar that we did. Before that, I did updates and talked about image management, and a lot of the questions we had were around files. So this webinar came kind of from those questions and what people wanted to talk about with files. The nice thing too is that we just released Files 3.7, so I will have some good updates around that as well. So today, Citrix Persona and Nutanix Files. So kind of the agenda here, we'll do a little introduction, just generalization with profile solutions and that kind of stuff. We'll talk about a Nutanix Files overview. We'll talk about using Citrix Profile Management with files, get into User Layer and User Personalization Layer with files, talk about FSLogix, get into Nutanix Files 3.7, because a lot of things I'll talk about are actually enhanced and improved with 3.7. And then we'll have questions at the end, but I'll also take questions as well as we go through things. So like Stephanie said, my name is Jarian Gibson. I recently got changed to a staff solutions architect, so a little bit of title change there, but you can find me at Jarian Gibson. I'm a Citrix technology professional for a number of years now. Also a co-leader of the Kansas City user group. So again, always happy to help out CUGC where I can. So profile solutions types, let's kind of talk about those just to kind of set the level. We have our container-based ones, Citrix User Layer, Citrix User Personalization Layer, Microsoft FSLogix, Microsoft Profile Disk. I have the container-based ones, ever since the Microsoft acquisition of FSLogix. FSLogix has been kind of the hot topic, but I still got a lot of stuff around user layers and user personalization layers. I'm not seeing as much user profile disk, and honestly, if you're using that, you should be looking at migrating to FSLogix. Looking at hybrid, Citrix Profile Management, that's going to be a combination of files and containers, depending on which features and functionality you're using. Out of the box, it's mainly with Profile Management. It's going to just be files, but you can enable 3 containers. 2 get enabled for Office, which is going to be the OST cache and the search index roaming. And then there's a 3rd one in more recent versions that you can enable for large file support. So you can redirect large files to the Profile Management profile container. OneDrive does not work with that, so you have to find other ways for OneDrive if you're using Profile Management, bolt on FSLogix Office containers, or migrate to FSLogix. And then you get into file-based, which honestly, I haven't seen a lot of file-based at all recently. Mandatory profiles, roaming profiles. If you're still using those, please migrate to something else because there's just not a lot of features and functionality that you get with the container-based or the hybrid solution. Of course, there's other third-party products I'm not going to get into. Again, a lot of the questions, a lot of the things I get into with customers are usually from Citrix or from Microsoft FSLogix when it comes to running on files. Again, file-based, everything is copied down to the VM on log on log off, all the files copy back, roaming profiles, mandatory profiles, all file-based solution. Hybrid, again, depending what you're using, it could be just files, it could be a combination of files and containers. The main thing here with hybrid is with profile management, it's going to copy the profile down, sync back the changes, and if you're using any of the containers functionality, those will be mounted in your profile store directory as well, directly from the share in VHDX format. When you get into container-based solutions, which these are pretty much the ones everyone's going to for one reason or another, with the Citrix ones or Microsoft, same thing. They're all going to be a container mounted from a share in VHD format when it comes to the Citrix ones, in VHDX format when it comes to FSLogix. And again, they're going to mount from the share. They're not going to do any copy down, copy back. It's all mounted from the share, and that's where we have to think of some additional things like high availability maintenance and other things that I'll get into as well. As a container-based, most of the people I come across are using FSLogix. If they need some functionality like user installed apps, that's when they're looking at the user layer, part of app layering, or the user personalization layer that came out in later versions that does the same functionality as user layer, but you don't have to go through the whole app layering process to get there. You can also use these in combination with each other too as well, and Citrix has a nice blog about that on making sure you have the right driver altitude for those. So when it comes into your profile solutions types considerations, and I'm kind of starting with this because it kind of leads into why we're using files, what's the benefits, that kind of stuff. But when you look at your profile solutions types considerations, especially when you get into the container type solutions, look at your sizing. How are you going to size those containers? What kind of things in group policy do you need to use to control the size of those containers, limiting cache? getting rid of orphan files, that kind of stuff. Maintenance, I know there are a lot of chat in the community, and I've been in some of these conversations as well, when it comes to a hybrid file-based versus a container-based. Are we doing the same exclusions and inclusions, or are we just letting everything go to the container and then doing maintenance during down periods of time? Single disk is always another topic too. So for example, with FSLogix, you have the profile container and you have the office container, with the office container being a subset of the profile container. Do you put all your eggs into one basket in the profile container, or do you split those out and put those in different containers? The main case there is that the office container is mainly cache. If that gets corrupted or lost, you still have all their settings, all the stuff they have in the profile container will still work. And then when it comes to things like high availability and replication and so forth, can you just do profile container and let them recreate the office container cache? Security, things about permissions, tools, that kind of stuff, exclusions. High availability and disaster recovery. Those have been some of the more hot topics lately, things like multi-site, things like DR. Do we have to look for a third-party product, or is there things built into the software? Are there things built into the infrastructure? How can we handle those type of things, etc.? So first thing is, profile solutions sizing. Again, with hybrid, especially with that file functionality, you're going to do your inclusions and exclusions because we're copying things down, we're syncing changes back. The main thing with any kind of file-based solution is you're trying to keep that profile as lean as possible. You want the best logon speeds because, again, we're copying stuff up, copying stuff back. So that thought's always, especially with profile management, what all can I exclude to make sure that that profile doesn't get bloated, and that impacts my login times, which puts extra overhead on my file servers, which can cause a bad user experience and so forth. Then when it comes into container-based hybrid solutions, since we're a mounted disk, we're not copying things down, we're not copying things back, we're mounting that whole disk from the file server. So, it's a more simplified setup. We're not really trying to get the fastest logon speeds by including and excluding things. Yes, you want to probably do some basic exclusions to keep some bloat out. But for the most part, you want to go through and make sure you're putting your proper policy in for caching things, for cleanup, base settings in to keep some of the bloat out. But the main thing with containers is we're going to use things like maintenance, dynamic disk, and do things like outlet cache sizing, OneDrive files on demand. But the main thing is taking those disks when we need to, using some of the scripts that are out there, and basically shrinking and compacting those and cleaning those up during low periods of time. The setup is more simplified with containers, but it's a little more planning, especially as you're adding things like outlet cache and OneDrive and other things that can actually fill up that pretty easily. So that's where you have the sizing there for those considerations. So when it gets into maintenance, again, hybrid, inclusions, exclusions, pruning if you miss some exclusions. A lot of that stuff can be done online, not really going to have to impact and think about maintenance windows or times when the user's offline, because we're copying things down, copying things up. We can do things with scripts and that kind of stuff to help prune those on the fly. When it comes to container-based, you kind of got to think of a maintenance time to compact and shrink those. Think about the offline maintenance, and then making sure we're doing some things to monitor and report so we're not running out of space and then getting some kind of help desk ticket generating event with users having problems logging in or having a bad user experience with those. So that's when we think about maintenance with the container-based and hybrid containers. So here's some things. There's other solutions out there for high availability and disaster recovery, but when we're using Nutanix Files, it's going to be more of an active passive with the built-in stuff. We can replicate at the storage level, protect that, bring the file server up on the DR side, and then restore from there. It's not really made for if you're going to be doing an active-active or an active-active pin solution with the built-in file stuff today. There used to be some HA considerations with files, especially with when it comes to disk. But I'll talk about some new things in 3.7 where I have the continuously available shares and persistent handle. So that helps with high availability for the active side of files, especially when it comes to containers, because it's going to basically lose connection and go back to the same file server VM it was connected to. The new CA functionality I'll talk about later on fixes that. One of the big ones that are built in is FSLogix has Cloud Cache. You can get to an active pin. The nice thing, again, it's built-in replication up to 4 locations. Definitely enabled for the profile container, office container. If you separate that out, again, when I talked about single disk versus multiple disk, do you want to fully replicate that? If you want to, or do you need to only replicate the profile container and let the office container recreate the cache on the other side if for some reason you don't have adequate bandwidth or you have issues replicating all the data of hundreds of thousands of users. If you're using things like user layers or user personalization layer or even profile management with the container options, the main thing there is that you usually have to do a third-party product. One I've tested is Peer Software to get more like an active and do multi-way replication, delta changes, and it can do any platform to any platform. So say you have your main data center is files and you're replicating to somewhere that's non-files, you can replicate a files deployment to a Windows instance or some other type of file storage. I've tested files to files and files to Windows. It does work great. And that's one that we have customers using as well for Peer Software. That's going to be additional cost, but it does work if you're looking for something for container-based solutions outside of FSLogix. If you're using FSLogix, I recommend use the Cloud Cache, especially with the latest releases of Cloud Cache. When they came in earlier versions, there were some issues with performance and logon stuff. They've since fixed that, and ever since they had that public preview a few months ago, I've been testing Cloud Cache a lot, and it's been rock solid in the later versions. Another third-party product is Backup 2, which I know is also popular. I know Dave, when he was on with our user case webinar we had a while back for Nutanix, he's using that for his replication before the Cloud Cache enhancements. Again, you can do active, multi-way replication, delta changes, any to any also. Just have to have that Windows VM to host the backup software. That's a third-party cost too as well. And there's some configuration you want to do there to making sure that you're doing replicating to one side from one and then another to the other. So there's some additional considerations with backup where Peer you set it up, configure it, and it kind of handles if you're pointing to the same targets. So high availability disaster recovery. Again, when you're getting a multi-site active passive or active pin is where you're probably going to look at for the most. Getting truly high available active can be challenging depending on the situation and the requirements. Just like I discussed, multiple replications available. If you're using FSLogix, it does work great with the later versions. Again, I've been testing this a lot with Nutanix Files. And then look at your configuration settings for replication. Like again, maybe only replicating user settings and not any kind of cache. But again, if you're looking for an active pinned, that's where if you're using FSLogix, look at Cloud Cache. If you're using user layers or user personalization layer or profile management with additional containers, that's where you'll use Peer Software or Backup V2 for those things, or another third-party solution that can handle Delta syncs and open files. Because the main thing with these VHD containers is you can't just copy them when they're being used because they're read-write mode, and so you have to find some kind of software that will handle that, whether it's at the storage level or whether it's at the application level that can actually do that for those read-write containers. And then other considerations, things that come across too. Keep your data close to your workloads, making sure keep them in the same data center, the same cluster if you can. We'll talk about how files can do that. Again, determine what you need to be replicated, protected in case of a multi-site or a disaster event, single disk, multiple disk, making sure you're taking those considerations. The main thing you want to grab is the user settings, any kind of data they need to do their job. And so you don't want them having to go into a DR event or log into a secondary site because for some reason there's an issue in the primary site and have to worry about them recreating their settings. Any security products, I come across this a lot where people are having slow logons or they're seeing some weird performance when they're logging on, making sure that you're following the the proper exclusions for the products. For containers, again, make sure you're getting the proper sizing up front. You don't have to go behind and do a ton of maintenance or add additional storage after the fact. So making sure when it comes to that, you're doing your proper sizing up front. And then, a big thing here is always understand the features and architecture, especially when it comes to the features and the limitations. And do you have to go get a third-party product if you're looking for a more active type scenario like you have to with user layers and user personalization layers. So that's kind of the quick overview of the file solutions. Any questions so far, Jake?
Yeah, just one actually from the active pinned profile definition you said. Can you just go into that a little bit more, just about how the pinning works?
Yeah, so active pin is basically what you're going to do is you'll have two sites that are active, both are running. And what you're going to do is with the active pin is you're always going to have users on one side go to, say, side A. So user A group is always going to go to side A for their primary. User side B is always going to go to user side B for their primary. And if there's some kind of issue, whether they can't connect or there's some kind of outage in the site, they just basically go to the other site as their backup site. So it's basically going to be a hot standby for the users on the primary side. The secondary side will be a hot standby, but you'll have active workloads on both sides to kind of either split the load or you're trying to route them to the closest type connection based on their office. So say you have like data centers spread out globally, and you're making sure that users always connect to the first office that's closest first, and then use the next closest office as their backup side. So that's where it kind of comes into active pin, but you're always running hot sites on both sides. The benefit of that too is that a lot of times you'll see customers who will set up DR sites, they'll do a periodic DR testing, but the DR site is cold, it's not always ready when they go to a DR test event. The nice thing too, when you're doing kind of an active pin, you're not only splitting the load and always using resources on both sides, but you're also making sure that both sides are always ready in an event one of the sides goes down. So that's where active pin comes into play.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So there I kind of got into some things to think about, what to look for, solutions. Now we're going to get into Nutanix Files overview. So the first thing here is Nutanix Files. It's part of our Nutanix infrastructure. So you can run files on the same cluster or a dedicated cluster. The one thing here is that you're going to have the same pane of glass management you have as your VMs and Prism. And it's going to be a scale out / scale up file server architecture. You're going to start with 3 file server VMs, create your shares, and then as you need to scale up or scale out, you modify based on that. So we're not having to deploy any kind of Windows file servers or using any kind of third-party external NAS appliances. And basically, the nice thing here is that you're using all your resources. So if you want to do a mixed workload, if your cluster is sized properly from the beginning to have files on as a mixed workload, or later on you say, hey, I have headroom, so I'm going to go ahead and add files on there to keep those on the same cluster as the users, you have both those options with Nutanix Files. Use cases, NAS storage, home shares. We're seeing a lot with redirected folders, profiles, even containers, and then using things like app layering, the Elm share, for user layers, for elastic layers, profile management, profile store, provisioning services, Vita store is another one we're seeing customers use. And then also if they're using ShareFile, the storage zones on-prem, they're using it for the on-prem file storage for storage zone controllers. The nice thing is that with files, as long as you're a licensed customer, you get 1 terabyte free to start with. And then you can buy additional storage there as you need it. So start off with some additional or initial use cases, and then go ahead and scale out from there to show that you can, combine that data together and use those resources. One thing too, we just had our clusters product go GA. And so what clusters is you can take our same AHV AOS software, same piece, same pane of glass management, but instead of running that in your data center, you can run that in AWS. So think of things like disaster recovery, bursting. I know in times like now with the pandemic, we're seeing a lot more uptake of users working from home. So being able to get additional resources spun up quickly, you can do that with clusters in AWS. Again, it's basically just AHV on bare metal AWS hardware. Instead of you having to procure the hardware, making sure that you have all that ready to go, you're basically just extending your workloads into clusters, and Files runs on that as well. And that's where some things you might talk about when we talk about multi-sites and HA, Cloud Cache, backup to peer, to making sure that you're replicating those user containers across both sides and keeping them in sync. So that's available now. That just went GA. Considerations for Nutanix Files. So one of the big one is going to be standard versus distributed shares. There are some challenges I'll talk about that we have with app layering and user personalization layer when it comes to distributed. I'll talk about some workarounds for that, and then I will also talk about what changes in 3.7 to further improve that workflow for users. The one thing with standard shares is basically you're going to one FSVM, and so all your connections are going through there. That's where if you have a lot of connections using a standard share, you may have to scale up the file server VM. Again, with files, we start off with 3 file server VMs and can scale out more to distribute connections across those file server VMs. But standard is always going to one where that share lives. When it comes to distributed shares, which we pretty much recommend for anything EUC related storage, so any kind of profiles or containers type stuff, we always recommend distributed shares. And basically what that does is that load balances connections across the file server VMs and making sure that there's distributed load, so you're not always going to one file server VM, but you're distributing connections across multiple file server VMs. If you're doing a small deployment with 3 FSVMs, it's going to load balance across 3. As you add more, it will start load balancing across the other file server VMs as well. And so that's where we come to scale up versus scale out. Standard shares, you may want to scale up because you're going to a single file server VM. But when it comes to distributed shares, and if you're starting ramping up your connections, say you start with a small deployment, maybe doing like your initial deployment of Nutanix and Files, and then later on you start onboarding more users, that's where you can scale out to more file server VMs to handle the load. Inside of Prism, there's recommendations for scale out versus scale up, and to help you kind of look at that to better manage your environment with files. And then the other one is going to be local cluster versus remote cluster. So we have a lot of customers that look at both options. Local cluster, again, you're going to have the file server VMs on the same cluster as your workloads. So they're going to be right there, high-speed connections to that file storage right there. Even with remote, we're still high-speed because we're doing top-of-the-rack switch and that kind of stuff. But one thing we saw in our testing with 3.6 files is that doing local versus remote cluster with FSLogix, we only saw about a 5% difference in CPU. So it only added about 5% CPU overhead, and I was testing about 960 users across several nodes to get that number. Of course, with 3.7 out, we're going to retest that and see what that is, because there is some performance enhancements in 3.7. But you're always looking at local versus remote. If you're having big, massive file storage, maybe I'm going to use a remote cluster, or a dedicated one. But we see a lot of customers that use it on the same customer, or on the same cluster, and they scale out the cluster and size that properly up front for that workload. So profile management we'll talk about with files. So the one thing here is the profile management. Again, your share type, you're going to want to use a distributed share, load balance those connections across those file server VMs. For location management, this is where proper OU planning is going to come out for your group policy objects, your group policy preferences, registry, and so forth. As far as making sure those are available across sites, whether you're doing, active-active or active-passive, if you're using all of the files-based functionality only of profile management and not enabling any of the container functionality, you can kind of manual copy script that pretty easily to kind of do that more regularly. Possibly even use DFS with one-way replication as another option. But if you're using any of the container functionality, so the Office container where you have both the Outlook and the search index, or the large profile container, if any VHDX file is being used, that can only be copied when it's offline. So you may have to schedule scripts to copy those in a DR use case. Or if you're doing more of an active use case, that's where third-party software like Peer or Backup 2 can come in. On the other hand, if it's a DR site, you can just use the file disaster recovery functionality, replicate the file's data, bring up the file server in a DR event on the other side, and go from there. As far as any issues with profile management or any extra configuration, there is a profile reset issue out of the box with files if you're on 3.6 or below. And I'll talk about how that changes in 3.7. But in 3.6 or below on distributed shares, what you'll see happen is you'll get errors when trying to do a profile reset. There is a command that you can run from the FSBM command line. You run on one FSBM. Basically, you disable the non-admin access. What this does is it still follows your security controls and your ACLs for the file structure, but by default, we only allow file server admins to delete anything at top level directories. So, basically your profile directory at the top of that share is a top level directory. There is a KB, so if you have access to our portal, explains the whole thing of how this works, the impact, the commands. But the main thing is that your network security and your ACLs are still honored when you disable this setting. Again, this by default with 3.6 and below, it's basically only allowing file server admins to delete things at the top level directory contents. User layer. So user layer, that's going to be, we support that too on files. You can use distributed share or standard share with manual distribution. The reason here I have an asterisk by user folders cause a distribution issue is because by default, or I'm sorry, not by default, but anything with user layer, it puts that extra users folder in the directory path, and then the users folder, and then their container. That does have issues with distribution, so there's a way to work around that, and there's some things I'll talk about how we address that in files 3.7 and going forward later on. So the use case here is that you want to use distributed, but there's it may not distribute properly. So you can use standard, but you have to do manual distribution, which I'll talk about. Location management, group policy preferences, or registry is to point them to, if you're doing like a multi-site deployment, always point them to the local file share for that. And then as far as distribution, same rules apply here as the profile management containers. When it's in use, you can't just copy it because it's in read-write mode. So you have to either schedule scripts to copy those during off periods of time, or use third-party software if you want an active-active type pin scenario. Use a third-party software like Peer or Backup2, which both I've tested and do work great for doing that. If it's just a DR site, that's where you can just use the file disaster recovery option there. Any questions, Jake, on profile management or user layer so far?
No, just a couple I've answered on the chat, but nothing else at the moment.
Okay, just checking my time here. So I'm good on time. So when I talked about you may have to do a manual distribution of user layers is because, again, they put that extra user folder in the path. And the way we distribute files is at the top level directory. And what I mean by top level directory is you're gonna have server name, share name, and the user folder. That user folder is a top level directory, and those get distributed across the file server VMs. Because user layers and user personalization layer both put that extra users folder in the path, it doesn't distribute properly, and so that's where you can set up multiple standard shares and then redirect those, or I'm sorry, direct users to the proper shares via group policy preferences, and so forth. And that way you're spreading the connections and you're spreading the data across the file server VMs because they're standard shares and they don't distribute by themselves. So that's where it comes to with user layers and getting that to work properly. Another option which I've seen customer use is trick it with DFS. And the way you trick it is you set up your DFS namespace, your folder in there, so domain, namespace, layers, and then put a user's target folder in there, and then point that user's target over to the distributed share. Basically, this tricks user layers and user personalization layers to both think they have that user's path in there, but that user's path folder is going directly to a distributed share, and then that distributed share basically load balances those connections automatically across those file server VMs. So you can kind of trick that, and again, this is 3.6 and below that this is required in. Again, I'll address 3.7 and going forward here soon with the new features. So that's how you do another option, either manual distribution or use the DFS trick for user layers. User personalization layer, pretty much the exact same thing as user layers. The main thing here is that your location management is going to be via the policy engine from Citrix. I think in 1912 or 1909, I can't remember which which release this came out, I think 1912 LTSR this came out in. But basically what user layers or user personalization layer, the main difference here between user layers is that with user layer, you have to do the whole app layering process. So you have to have the Elm, you have to go through and bring your image, export your image, enable through the Elm, that kind of stuff. What they do with user personalization layer is it's the exact same features and functionality as user layer, but instead of having to use app layering, this is all controlled through the VDA and the policy engine. So when you install the VDA, you select the option for user personalization layer. Once that's done, you do your non-persistent image, MCS or PBS, and then basically inside of the policy engine, you point it to your share path, and then you enable the size of it. By default 10 gig, you can go higher. And I think in 2003 or 2006, they added a feature to where if you change, or it's coming, I think it's coming, or maybe it's just user layers, where you change the size of it, it automatically grows for you. I think that's only in user layers today, but I think that should be coming soon for user personalization layer also. But again, the main thing here, other than those changes of how the infrastructure is, the exact same things I just talked about for user layers apply for user personalization layer. So again, read-write container, manual scripted offline, scheduled tasks, third-party software, file disaster recovery. When it comes to distributing those, because again, user personalization layer also puts that extra users folder into the path. So when it comes to that, same thing I said with user layers is that you're going to have to do standard shares and manually distribute, use the DFS trick that I talked about. Basically, we're using a DFS leaf to think it's doing that, but going right to a distributed share. And so that's the thing you can do with user personalization layer and users layers with 3.6 and below or files. FSLogix. So this one, pretty much FSLogix, what you're going to do is distributed share. There is a file setting change I'll talk about. It's basically the same issue I talked about with director profile reset. Once you have that set up, you're good to go with FSLogix. That setting does persist during upgrades, and all you have to do is enable it once on one of the file server VMs in deployment, and it applies to all of them in deployment. Location management, again, group policy preferences, registry, distribution, cloud cache. I have an asterisk there because if you're on later versions of FSLogix, cloud cache works great. I've seen no issues that I saw on earlier versions. So if you're using FSLogix and you're doing any kind of active pinned, whether it's files or anything else underneath, that works great for making sure that is replicated to multiple locations, up to 4, and that's highly available as well. The one thing too with cloud cache also is that cloud cache will survive if you're doing some kind of, like, say happens the file server VM you're connected to has an outage or a communication issue with it. Cloud cache will still function and not have an issue, so it'll overcome even local disruptions as well. One thing we have with files 3.6 and earlier is a thing called durable handles, where the session will reconnect to the same file server VM, but there's some enhancements that I'll talk about here in the next few slides about what Files 3.7 does to even enhance that, whether using Cloud Cache or not. Another thing with Cloud Cache, if you're using Cloud Cache out of the box, so a lot of customers will start with VHD locations for the share settings, but then later on migrate to Cloud Cache. If you start off with the VHD location setting, that's where that files change comes in, that setting that I talked about, the same one for director. If you start off from scratch with Cloud Cache, that setting is not needed. Only the VHD locations does that test path thing that I'll talk about here in the next slide. So what I mean here is the issue with FSLogix containers. What happens is when you use Office container or use Profile container, what it does is it does a test folder and it does your regular folder. This only happens in VHD locations. With that same issue I talked about with the director reset, where we have the TLD by default, non-file server admins can't delete that top level directory, and so that's where that setting gets enabled, and that way you can fix that when you're deploying files on distributed shares if you're doing VHD locations. Now, if you're using Cloud Cache from the start, you won't see this problem, and you'll be good to go from there. But there's some things coming that we address that with Files 3.7 also. The same KB article I talked about with the profile director, with director profile reset, that also talks about the same exact information on this. So if you have access to our portal, go ahead and take a look at that. All customers have access to that portal to see that. But the same thing, ACLs are still they're still applied. It just says, non-file server admins can delete their own directories with the permissions to them. So before I get to Files 3.7, any questions so far?
Nothing at the moment, no.
Okay. Either no one wants to answer questions today, or I'm answering all your questions that we had in the previous webinars about this. So hopefully I'm answering all your questions as I'm talking. So Nutanix Files 3.7, this came out last month. With me, I work in the EUC engineering team. And so I do a lot of files testing, and a lot of things we've been asking. Our files team has been doing and been very collaborative and making sure they're enhancing files to make it the best it can be, especially for EUC workloads. And some things that we asked for and things that we found got put in the Files 3.7 release. Two big things for EUC, Citrix Persona on files got fixed in Files 3.7. There's more things coming that we've asked for, and there's a lot more features and functionality that came out in Files 3.7 with performance and other things. So that QR code with that link is to a blog post that goes over the full release of Files 3.7. But when it comes to the things I talked about with Files 3.6 and below, those things went away with Files 3.7. So the first one here on the left, mounting shares as subfolders. So what this allows us to do is distribute a directory across multiple file server VMs in any file in the tree. So when we go to app layering or with user layers or user personalization management or user personalization layers, what happens is instead of going to server name, share name, and distributing that user folder or that folder there, what we can do now is we can also distribute that user's folder that it puts in the path. So no longer will you have to do that workaround that I talked about with either standard shares in mail distribution or using that DFS Trick workaround. What you can do is that extra folder, the user's folder, you can now make that a distributed folder properly with Files 3.7. The other thing we have is now continuously available shares. It's in tech preview in Files 3.7. But what this does is, I talked earlier about durable handles. So if there's any kind of issue with the file server VM, the session will recover to the same file server VM. But for some reason, if it can't, it's going to basically have a problem with the session. With our CA tech preview, it's going to go to, it's going to have persistent file server handles across the file server VMs, not just the ones they're connected to. And what that means is if we have any kind of file server VM outage, that VHD, that session is going to get connected to another file server VM automatically in the deployment. So this is good for FSLogix if you're not using Cloud Cache, user layers, user personalization layers, the profile container functionality, and the Office containers and profile management, or any solution that is using any kind of VHD or VHDX container with files. Again, this is in tech preview in 3.7. If something you're interested in testing, reach out to me. Let us know, and we can get you in that tech preview to start testing this and get feedback from you for continuously available shares. Again, we have a lot more improvements in Files 3.7, but these are the two huge ones that we've seen with challenges with customers in EUC with Citrix and containers and stuff on Nutanix Files. So these are the two big ones that I wanted to point out as it relates to this presentation. So mounting shares as subfolders. So what this allows you to do is you have a standard share. So in this example, I have my EUC file server deployment with a UPL share. There's that users folder. In a standard deployment, that users folder, the actual user directories underneath there would not distribute properly. So what we do is we mount that to a distributed share, and that distributed share then mounts that users folder. And now that users folder that has the actual user directories with their user layer container or their user personalization layer container now gets distributed across multiple file server VMs instead of having to do those workarounds. So this is available in 3.7. I've been testing this, working with it. It does work really well. So if your Files 3.7 and you're using app layer and user layers or using user personalization layers, here's a new option instead of having to do those workarounds I talked about, which some customers are doing as far as making that users folder distribute across multiple file server VMs. The next one is going to be is our continuous availability shares text preview. Again, this basically fails over those connections, those user sessions with the VHD mounted over to another file server VM deployment. It's non-disruptive. FSLogix, app layering, user personalization layers, profile management containers, any solution that you're doing that it's a profile solution, the third-party ones even that use a VHD or VHDX container, this all falls under that. Reconnects during planned or unplanned scenarios. If you get multi-failures, that's where you might not have the best experience there, but we build with resilience, so that's where you're scaling out your deployment comes in handy with file server VMs. So you'll have durable and persistent file handles to those containers on these shares with CA shares. Persistent file handle support, transparent failover, all that kind of stuff is now in CA shares. Again, it's in tech preview. So if you are interested, reach out either to me, reach out to your Nutanix rep to start testing this. And that way you can get feedback. And that way this can be GA released in a future files version. One last thing, this isn't really in the files release notes, but the two things I talked about for files 3.6 and below with the director profile reset and the FSLogix VHD locations, where you have to change that setting in the files deployment. And files 3.7 out of the box now, that is set to where you don't have to go and change that. So using FSLogix, using your director profile reset, out of the box, you just set up your distributed shares, put your proper permissions in, set up your VHD locations or your profile store, and go. No extra files server commands need to be ran. So that also was fixed too as well. So it's easier configuration, especially for a lot of customers who are using FSLogix, which I'm seeing the majority of, and the majority of questions I'm getting. I want to leave a lot of time for questions in case we had some. So we have about 10 minutes left here. So let's go ahead and open up questions and answer any questions. I know last time I had a lot of questions around files. That KB, yeah. So that KB is going to be a Nutanix KB. So if you're a customer and you have access to our Nutanix portal, you can get the KB. It goes into more depth explanation. But what that KB does is it tells you the commands to run, or the command to run, which is one command, and then explains the issue, what's going on. And basically what the issue is, again, is that by default, we only allow file server admins to delete top-level directories. What it does is when you turn that setting off with file 3.6 and below, it follows the folder permissions for that top-level directory. And so that test path issue that I show with FSLogix doesn't happen with VHD locations. With that command set, or if you run files 3.7, you'll see the same thing. All we did was make it to say, hey, just follow the permissions for that. We're not putting any extra security on that with top-level directories. So again, that KB is going to be a Nutanix support portal KB for customers. Any other questions?
There's one here about the availability of Nutanix files on the CE edition. Is that something that's available, or is that a sort of license feature only? Or?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So you can run files on the community edition. You can download files from the portal, or I think now the CE download has files. I thought they added that or not. I'll double check. But when you deploy files, there's two things you upload to Prism. You upload the file software, and you upload a JSON file, the metadata file. All you have to do is edit that metadata file, and you can deploy files on CE. We have customers doing that already for testing in labs where they're using files, and some people in the community also. I can put the information out there as well, exactly that works, because I'm going to be doing some stuff anyways. There's also a blog in process as well that goes through FSLogix. Set up with 3.6 and below, and the whole thing's around. I explained the issue. I explained the commands. There's also some performance testing that we've done as well that we're going to redo with 3.7. All that will be in the blog post. It's in process. I'm just waiting for the release of it to be out there on the portal, and then I'll do a follow-up blog on files 3.7 with the similar blog, also with testing CA shares as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Mhm.
There's another really good question here about the AB profile location in the active scenario you ran through earlier. The question is around how that's set up. So, is that automatic, or is that something where the admin needs to make a conscious decision to say these people are in location A, these are in location B? So what are the options and best practices around that, really?
Yeah, so it's more admin configuration. One is there's a couple ways you can do it. GSLB and using optimal gateway routing and the storefront configuration is one way. Another way you can do it is have backup and especially non-persistent. The active pin works better, better in the non-persistent world, because you're just replicating the master image, having the MCS or PVS things deployed, and then just replicating the user settings. If you're using persistent type desktops, it's going to be more replicate that desktop in more of an active passive, active cold type scenario. So active pin works really well in non-persistent functionality. So a couple ways you can do it. One is through GSLB, optimal gateway routing, storefront configuration, and so forth. The other way with non-persistent, which I've seen the customers do as well, is set up primary and backup desktop icons. So they always click on one first, and they go to the one site, and they click on the secondary if the other one's available, and go to the other site. So there is some extra configuration there with admins. But from the users, it's mostly if you do it all through the NetScaler and storefront and your settings in Studio, it's seamless to the user. If you do the primary and secondary desktop I talked about, they'll see two icons, but they have to just click on the other one and go to the other site. If you check out our multi-site session that I've done with Shane and Dave and Case, we go through all that in detail about active pinning, configuration things for that when it comes to storefront and NetScaler, and those are synergy sessions that are posted on YouTube. Both of our sessions are out there from not this year, but last year's synergy and the synergy before that we go into depth about active pin.
Yeah, that's brilliant, thank you. In terms of the handling on files and things like, when you got something like a database, an access database file, for example, is that something that you would need to look at, if you got something that actually has an open connection or something like that, you'd need to look at a manual replication method or script that afterwards?
Yeah, so usually those kind of things with like a database file or something that has like an open lock on it where you can't just pick it up and copy that. That may be where you need like a third-party product to replicate that. If it's going to be inside of your container for FSLogix, FSLogix will take care of that with the cloud cache, because anything you have in your container is going to be replicated. Or you can look at a third-party product that can do it as well, that can handle open locked files. I know if it's something like DFS replication where you're like a backup target, it's going to try to replicate it, but it's going to basically replicate it when it's not in use. Yeah. The same thing if you try to replicate VHD files with DFS replication, it basically would replicate it when it's not in use, not when it's locked.
There's another really good question here about sort of container-based replication compared with file-based replication. Are there any sort of performance differences in terms of things that would make a major impact on the desktop, or in terms of performance, is one going to have a massive benefit over the other?
So from what I've seen with the replication, so you're talking about replicating the containers, whether it's through like when the container's not in use versus using like a solution to where it can replicate it while it's in use type thing. Is that the question is?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so when I've tested with Peer and backup, I have not really seen any performance issues on the user experience side when it comes to replicating that file, because basically it's only doing the delta of the file. I haven't really seen any performance issues on the user side. One thing I'll need to do some more testing is is probably at scale to see what that does to the file server side when that's going on. From customers that I know that are doing some of those things, I haven't heard any negative feedback on that. So that's something I'll have to do some testing and scaling with that. I know with FSLogix Cloud Cache, we did that test at scale. we didn't see a lot of overhead of that. The only thing that FSLogix impacted on that was on the user side. It does, and this is in the FSLogix documentation as well, is that Cloud Cache, because it's going to copy that disk locally and then do things locally and then copy that out to your locations for Cloud Cache. There was a slightly bit of performance overhead, along with slightly, a little bit of logon time there. But in the later versions, where, like I said, it's gotten a lot better, it's not that big of a difference as far as user experience wise for the login or the overhead in the session.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you. Another question here, this is probably quite a quick one actually. Is there any sort of Nutanix guidance around setting up active profile solutions? So are there any sort of white papers or articles we could share with the guys?
So now that 3.7 is out, one thing that I've been tasked to do is do a files best practice / reference architecture guide. So one of the things I do at Nutanix in my role is I work on our best practices guides, some of our solutions notes, our reference architecture stuff for Citrix. That's what we do within our team. Myself and my counterpart Sven do that. And so one of the tasks I have now that we have 3.7 is to do one around these solutions. FSLogix is going to be the first one that's going to come out in that, and then start working with app layering, user personalization layer, which pretty much with the same thing, so the same functionality, and profile management. I'll probably stop at those 4 solutions because those are the most ones I come across. We typically don't do the third-party stuff outside of what's built into the solutions or available out of the box. But yeah, that's something that's going to be in process, and that'll be published here hopefully sooner than later.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you. I thought that might be the case. Sorry, I just put something else on your list there.
Yeah, the initial thing will be a blog post for files and FSLogix, and I'll probably do some more around app layering, user layers, and user personalization layers, along with profile management as well as blog posts initially, and then you'll see those in a reference architecture / best practices guide.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you. That's pretty much it for the questions.
So I actually finished on time for once. Usually I go over and I have 1 minute to spare. I just checked my time. So I just want to thank everyone for attending today. Hopefully everyone's well in these different times we're going through. Hopefully everyone's staying safe. And once again, thank you for attending today. Thank you for having me, Stephanie, and thank you for moderating again, Jake.
No problem at all.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, it was awesome.
Lots of stuff going on there. Thank you. Like Jarian said, I just want to thank you all for being here today. Just a couple of notes to close out with. If you opted in for a chance to win the Lego Star Wars Millennium Falcon, now that I know most of you are working from home, it'll give you something else to do. We'll make that random drawing after the webinar is over, and we'll put the winner out on Twitter. So be sure to follow us on Twitter so that you know who won. And also, I'm putting a link in the chat right now to our survey. Just want to get your feedback, as I mentioned earlier. Love to get your comments and your feedback. It really helps us plan all of our webinar content going forward. So be sure to fill that out. And yeah, just be sure to check out mycugc.org if you haven't checked in lately. There's lots of new blog posts, more upcoming webinars. We're still doing our local events, all that great stuff. And the forums are still going if you have questions or want to talk about something or maybe help somebody out. So definitely pop by when you have a chance and check that out. And with that, I will let you all get back to your day. And like Jarian said, I hope you're all healthy and well and continue to be that way. So hopefully we'll all get together again in the future in person. But until then, we'll see you all online at the next virtual event. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Cheers. Take care.